Peering out from the dark shadows of America's death row are the faces of evil. The faces of murderers. Men and women who commit the most heinous of crimes. Men and women who often evade capture for years, decades. But eventually, these lowest forms of humanity find themselves on death row, awaiting their final fate: execution. This is the story of the ultimate punishment, death, and the portraits of the worst who were put to death by the feds and the states in America. In this program, we will look at death row's most famous cases, killers, and executions. These austere and haunting death row cells were not only occupied by serial killers who kill over an extended period of time and have a distinct signature, but also spree killers, bombers, rapists, kidnappers, anarchists, and the Wild West's most infamous gunslingers. Indeed, in this grave in Boulder, Colorado rests, or at least lies, the baddest, the most prolific of the Old West's gunslingers. Tom Horn is claimed to have killed more people than Billy the Kid, Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, and Jesse James combined.
Tom Horn was a badass. Let's just start right there. And this is a guy who was a lawman and an outlaw, and a lawman and an outlaw. He was both, and he seemed to go kind of back and forth across the line. And another very famous Western lawman, Charlie Siringo, who founded the New Mexico Rangers, said of Tom Horn that he was one of the best trackers, one of the best law enforcement people he'd ever seen, but that he was touched with evil. And that's kind of the case. He works for the Pinkertons, he works as a deputy marshal, but then he kind of goes freelance. He says he's a range detective, but what he really is a hired gun in these range wars between the cattle ranchers and in some cases farmers, in some cases sheep herders.
After a stint in the U.S. Army fighting in the Spanish-American War, Horn returned to the only place where the old Wild West was still alive: Wyoming Territory. Here in 1901, Horn began working for wealthy cattle baron John C. Coble as an enforcer. It's hard to believe that in the 20th century, cattle range wars were still being waged, but they were. Curiously, at this time, Horn seems to have found love with Gwendoline M. Kimmel, a school teacher who just happened to be teaching the children of two feuding ranch families: the cattle ranching Millers and the sheep herding Nichols. On July 18, 1901, Willie Nickel, the 14-year-old son of the sheep herding rancher, was murdered in cold blood by a distant assassin. The MO fit Horn perfectly, and he immediately became the prime suspect.
The individual that he supposedly killed, the 14-year-old boy, had been involved, the boy hadn't been involved, but his father had been involved in a rancorous dispute with neighbors who were also named as alternate suspects in the shooting. It was rather strange that Tom Horn was seen in the area, but his confession in jail was obtained by a Pinkerton agent, another shady organization at that time, in my opinion, labor strike breakers, and some of them were virtual assassins.
He supposedly confesses. There is an actual confession. He's apparently drunk at the time, and it's a pretty vague, sketchy confession. Interestingly enough, the confession is made to a U.S. Marshal named Joe LaForge. Now, Joe LaForge might be a familiar name to you if you ever saw the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid movie. He's the guy leading that super posse that is supposedly is chasing Butch and Sundance in the movie. So Joe LaForge is a pretty legendary lawman. Here's Tom Horn, who's a pretty legendary lawman and outlaw. He gets a confession out of Horn, and eventually they get a conviction out of him.
On November 20th, 1903, Tom Horn, outlaw and lawman, all rolled up into one, was hung by the water-powered Julian Gallows in Cheyenne, Wyoming. With his death, the era of the Wild West was over. But its lawless way of life would carry on into a new era. The era of the Roaring Twenties. The era of jazz, the flapper, and the speakeasy. During this time, gangsters and average Joes alike rubbed elbows in these hidden clubs drinking illegal booze. It was also a time when a murderous and desperate political movement was in full swing. The anarchists, an uncontrollable group on the fringe of society that was behind many horrendous bombings in 1919. No anarchists were more famous or infamous than the Italian immigrants Sacco and Vanzetti. Yet nearly 100 years later, their guilt is still uncertain.
To their supporters, Sacco and Vanzetti were, in Vanzetti's words, a good shoemaker and a poor fish peddler. They were prosecuted and they were executed because they were radicals and immigrants in a society that would tolerate neither.
Indeed, the trial and conviction of Sacco and Vanzetti is, to this day, the most controversial of all the high-profile murder trials and executions in America. It started with a $15,776 heist, a payroll robbery of the Slater Morrill Shoe Company in South Braintree, Massachusetts. It happened on the afternoon of April 15th, 1920. During the robbery, Frederick Parmenter, a paymaster, and Alessandro Berardelli, a security guard, were shot dead. On May 5th, Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested for the crime and put on trial.
The physical evidence presented at the trial appeared damning. When he was arrested, Vanzetti was carrying a gun that was the same kind of gun as the guard had at the factory where the robbery and murder took place. Prosecutors argued that Vanzetti had taken the gun from the guard during the murder or after the murder. For Sacco, the situation was even worse. Two expert witnesses testified that the bullet that went through the guard's body came from Sacco's gun.
The judge in their trial was outrageously biased against the defense, and supposedly, after he sentenced Sacco and Vanzetti to death at a dinner party, remarked to the other laughing guests, "Did you see what I did to those anarchist bastards?"
Following their conviction on July 14th, 1921, the years leading up to their execution spawned the phenomena of widespread protests, mass movements, and celebrity causes. Celebrity causes that tried to win the release of many other supposedly unjustly convicted citizens. The two men attempted numerous appeals to higher courts, but it was useless. After 6 miserable years on death row, the two immigrant anarchists were electrocuted on August 23, 1927. We will never know beyond a shadow of a doubt if Sacco and Vanzetti were truly guilty. That secret died long ago with these two Italian immigrants in the electric chair. Another immigrant was accused of a different heinous crime, but his case would be called the trial of the century. That man was Bruno Hauptmann. The case was the Lindbergh kidnapping.
Of the most famous trials of the 20th century, Sacco and Vanzetti, the Rosenbergs, Alger Hiss, O.J. Simpson, the Lindbergh case stands out for its lack of political significance. This was not a case about race. This was not a case about politics. And yet it gripped America at least as firmly as any of those other cases. You had hot dog vendors lining the street where the body was found. You had sightseeing planes circling the scene of the crime. You had 12,000 people writing to the Lindberghs just to tell about their dreams about the kidnapping.
In 1932, Charles Lucky Lindbergh was America's most well-known and most beloved man, an aviation hero, high in the pantheon of America's super aviators. The Wright brothers, Amelia Earhart, Chuck Yeager, and Neil Armstrong. 5 years earlier, in the now famous Spirit of St. Louis, Lindbergh made the first solo transatlantic flight from New York to Paris. And then, the unimaginable happened. On March 1st, 1932, the nursemaid, Betty Gow, put 20-month-old Charles Lindbergh Jr. in his crib in an upstairs bedroom. Sometime in the next 20 minutes, it happened. Somebody took the baby.
Somebody used the ladder and got into the window, took the baby, and probably trying to keep the baby from crying. Because it wasn't a tiny baby. It was a young enough child to be frightened by what was going on. My guess was they probably accidentally smothered him, trying to keep him quiet, taking him out of the lawn, and a pretty big estate, and out into the woods, and then wouldn't really realize the baby was dead, tried to hide the body, but not wanting to give up on this score, they decided to play it out like they still had the baby, take the ransom money, and disappear. It just didn't work out that way.
At 10 p.m., Gal discovered that the baby was missing from his crib. Lindbergh raced to the nursery to see for himself. There, he discovered a ransom note. "Dear Sir, have $50,000 ready, $25,000 in $20 bills, $15,000 in $10 bills, and $10,000 in $5 bills. After 2 to 4 days, we will inform you where to deliver the money." Frantic to get their son back, the Lindberghs paid the ransom. An intermediary gave the money to a mysterious man in a New York City cemetery. In exchange, he handed over a note saying the Lindbergh son was being held on a boat called the Nellie on Martha's Vineyard. The child was supposedly in the care of 2 women who, according to the note, were innocent. Lindbergh went there and searched the docks. However, there was no boat called the Nellie. A desperate Lindbergh even flew a plane low over the boats in an attempt to startle the kidnappers into showing themselves. After 2 days, Lindbergh admitted he had been duped. Then the worst happened. On May 12, 1932, delivery truck driver William Allen discovered the corpse of a toddler only 4.5 miles from the Lindbergh home. Allen notified police, who took the body to a morgue in nearby Trenton, New Jersey. A distraught Charles Lindbergh identified the body as his kidnapped son. For 2 years, the police searched for the kidnappers. They found nothing. Then, on September 17, 1934, ransom money was used to pay for gas. The money was in the form of the rapidly dwindling gold certificate, so the attendant wrote down the customer's license plate number. The car belonged to a German immigrant, Bruno Hauptmann, who 2 days later was arrested for the kidnapping and murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr. In a trial that was held from January 2nd to February 13th, 1935, Hauptmann was found guilty as the sole murdering kidnapper and given the death penalty.
Hauptmann might have been, just a scapegoat for the whole thing if there weren't things that tied him to it. See, that's the problem I have with it. I think there was enough evidence to show that he was linked to this kidnapping in some way, not the least of which was the wood from the ladder that was built right out of his garage, was built using that wood. It's possible that he could have been just, the whole thing pinned on him. But I honestly do think he was involved in some way.
The Lindbergh kidnapping fascinates me for two reasons, and one is that I personally believe that Hauptmann was framed for the crime and that he was innocent. And the other thing that intrigues me is that they could never actually prove that the Lindbergh child was killed per se. Years later, when they finally got Hauptmann, there's no doubt that some of the evidence against him was manufactured. For example, they claim that they did find Lindbergh's phone number penciled inside Hauptmann's closet, but a reporter for one of the New York tabloids later admitted that he wrote it there so that he could get the exclusive story. Some of the boards supposedly ripped up to build the ladder didn't really match as far as the nail holes and so forth. I think there was a frame up by the New Jersey State Police to try to clear the books on the case. And FBI files that have surfaced since that time even indicate that J. Edgar Hoover himself thought some of the evidence was very iffy. But of course somebody had to fry for it, and Hauptmann's story about getting the money from Isidore Fish, who was then already dead in Europe and couldn't be questioned, left him hanging out there in the breeze.
Nevertheless, Hauptmann was electrocuted by Old Smoky at the New Jersey State Prison on April 3rd, 1936.
Yet Hauptmann proclaimed his innocence right up until his death. Even when the governor of New Jersey offered to convert the death sentence to life in prison in return for a confession, Hauptmann refused.
Ironically, the most famous trial and execution of the 20th century might have been one of America's greatest miscarriages of justice. 40 years before Timothy McVeigh callously killed 168 innocent people in the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, another cowardly bomber massacred 44 people, including his own mother. This coward was Jack Gilbert Graham. Denver, Colorado native Jack Gilbert Graham mixed the technology of complex bomb building with America's emerging airline industry to make good on his own personal revenge. It was 1955. The days when airplane passengers believed the only danger to flying was the weather. Graham would change all that just to get even with his mother for the way she constantly belittled him as a child, and the way she ran his life when he became an adult. In an instant, the skies were no longer safe. On that fateful evening of November 1st, 1955, Jack's mother, Mrs. Daisy King, was on her way to Alaska to visit her daughter.
Jack Gilbert Graham in 1955 placed a bomb in his mother's luggage before she was about to take a flight. And as the plane took off, it exploded in the air. This took place in Colorado. It ended up killing more than 40 people. And prior to placing the bomb in his mother's luggage, he had purchased insurance at the airport so that he would collect $37,500 when she passed away. And that ultimately is what led police to Graham, is that they're able to discover that he was the one who was responsible for placing the bomb in her luggage.
The plane exploded over the sugar beet fields of eastern Colorado. 44 passengers and crew hurtled to the earth in the fiery wreckage. No one survived. And in Graham's twisted mind, there was nothing wrong with that.
In the Graham case, you've got another example of somebody who targeted, it appears, one person, his mother, and placed the bomb in the suitcase that went onto that plane, and he was so narcissistic and self-centered that he wasn't thinking about all those other victims.
Or were those innocent victims an evil necessity to cover up his crime?
You know, Graham is one of several killers who wanted to kill a particular person and then decided to make it look as though it was a random massacre. There are several killers who had a particular victim in mind, but they tried to make it look as though it was a random attack by killing a number of people who were unrelated to their motive.
The media sensationalized the trial. TV cameras were allowed into the courtroom for the first time in U.S. history. It didn't take the jury long to convict Graham of first-degree murder and give him the death penalty. On July 11, 1957, only 8 months after he was sentenced, Graham met his fate in the Colorado State Penitentiary's gas chamber. Some of his last words were, "As far as feeling remorse for these people, I don't. I can't help it. Everybody pays their way and takes their chances. That's just the way it goes." Graham's horrifying bombing was later made into a movie, The FBI Story, starring James Stewart and Nick Adams as Jack Gilbert Graham. Unlike Graham's impersonal style of killing, Stephen A. Nash killed his victims intimately, stabbing them with a knife or beating them with a lead pipe. He called himself the King of Killers. Robert Keller has written more than 60 true crime books on killers. He knows Nash's story very well.
Stephen Nash confessed to 11 murders, all of them committed over a 6-week period. It's such a frenetic pace that he's more commonly referred to as a spree killer than a serial killer. The murders happened between October and November 1956, and the most infamous of them is probably the killing of 10-year-old Larry Rice. The boy was lured under the boardwalk at Santa Monica and then hacked to death. When Nash was later asked why he'd killed Larry Rice, he said it was because he'd never killed a kid before and he wanted to see what it felt like. But over that period, that short 6-week period, he in fact killed 10 other people, including a 27-year-old hairdresser by the name of William Berg, who made the very grave mistake of inviting Nash back to his apartment and was then beaten and hacked to death.
Legendary LA detective Larry Scarborough was hot on Nash's tail, thanks to the account of Dennis Butler, a victim that luckily survived one of Nash's deadly attacks. He described a shabby, toothless, 6-foot-plus drifter who, after a few drinks, became violent and erratic, stabbing and beating him. He gave a name, Steve Nash. A manhunt ensued. Luckily, Nash was arrested in a routine roundup of vagrants. Scarborough had his man. It didn't take long before Nash confessed to the 5 murders that Scarborough knew of, but hinted at many more.
When Nash was asked about the other murders that he'd committed, he said that he'd only confessed them on the basis of the police paying him $200 per confession, which they obviously declined because they already had enough information, enough evidence to convict him of murder.
The trial was swift. Judge Burton Noble called Nash the most evil person who ever appeared in my court. After he was convicted and sentenced to death, he boasted, "I'm the king of killers." He was then shipped off to California's infamous San Quentin prison to await execution.
Stephen Nash's time on death row was fairly short, less than 3 years, compared to the decades that convicted murderers spend on death row these days. While he was there, he remained unrepentant, who insisted that he had a hatred for all humanity. He continued to offer other confessions while on death row, but only on the basis of being paid for them. But in the meantime, he remained pretty indifferent to his own death. When, on the day that he was put to death, he had a press conference, and at the time, in response to one of the questions, he said that he had a lot to die for and nothing to live for, so he looked forward to his own death.
On August 21st, 1959, the unrepentant, self-proclaimed king of killers left his cell and walked to San Quentin's gas chamber, never to return. If Stephen Nash defined the spree killer, whose murderous impulses perpetrated carnage and death in one area, Los Angeles, Charles Starkweather defined the spree killer on the run.
Prototype classic spree killing would be the Charlie Starkweather Carol Fugate case from the 50s, where the two teenagers, boyfriend, girlfriend, went from state to state, killing 10 people, including her parents. That murder spree was going to continue until they got captured, which they were.
Charles Starkweather was born in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1938. He claims to have had a pleasant home life growing up as a child. But in school, it was a different story. He was constantly teased and bullied by classmates. As a result, he developed a rage against bullies, and soon his anger and rage extended beyond the individuals who tormented him to anyone he happened to dislike. Someone who was unable to do anything correctly, characteristics ever dooming him to a life of misery and poverty. Then, in 1958, 18-year-old Starkweather's life changed when he met 13-year-old Carol Ann Fugate. A relationship developed between these two unlikely lost souls, the kind of relationship that would soon come to foster the buddy concept of spree killings.
I'm aware of cases where there are two perpetrators involved, not unusual for it to be someone older, someone younger, the younger perpetrator being, if you will, under the influence of, being controlled by the older offender. And there's this chemistry that sometimes occurs between two people where they end up fueling each other's fantasies.
A year after meeting Fugate, Charlie had sunk to the lowest of lows. From this place of despair, he developed a philosophy to live his life by and to murder by. He said, "Dead people are all on the same level." It was a philosophy that many mass murderers would come to embody. On November 30th, 1957, Charles Starkweather got his first taste of killing.
He went into a gas station in Lincoln, Nebraska, with a mask over his head and a shotgun, took the young man who was the employee there alone at the gas station, kidnapped him and took him with him out to a rural road and shot him to death, execution style, in the head, and left him on that cold road for a robbery take of around $100. Now apparently He shared with Carol and Fugate the information that he'd shot this boy, but there was no immediate police attention on him. They thought it was a random crime, and so some time went by before he then went the next step with Carol and Fugate to become the spree killer that we know.
2 months later, Starkweather's killing spree began.
He came into Carol Ann's house where her mother and her stepfather and her 2-year-old sister were, and apparently there was an argument over his relationship with Carol Ann, which ended in him murdering all 3 family members, shooting the mother and the stepfather, beating the 2-year-old sister of Carol Ann Fugate to death with the butt of his shotgun.
Now Starkweather and Fugate began their classic spree killing on the run.
The bodies had been discovered in Carol's home, and they were suspects. Now they were on the run. Bob Jensen and his girlfriend stopped to help Charles and Carol, and instead were taken captive, taken to an abandoned schoolhouse nearby, and led into the storm cellar where they were murdered with the shotgun. And so they drove to a more affluent part of town, of Lincoln, where they invaded a home that Charles had targeted when he was trash collecting as part of his job earlier. They broke into this home, found the woman of the house there with her maid. Both were murdered. The man of the house came home and he was killed as well. Charles and Carol Ann then stole their Packard automobile and decided to leave the state and head for Washington. They made it as far as Wyoming, where they decided to ditch their car and steal a car that they found parked along the side of the road. A young man was sleeping in the car. He was murdered. As this murder was happening, a sheriff came upon the scene, and at that moment Carol Ann ran to the sheriff saying that her partner had just killed a man, and a car chase ensued with Carol in the sheriff's car, Charles and the man's dead body in the other car. Gunshots were exchanged over the back roads until finally Charles's car stopped and he was arrested.
Years later, Starkweather and Fugate's rampage became a part of popular American culture. In Bruce Springsteen's 1982 album, Nebraska, his title song was a lament on Starkweather's rampage. Stephen King reincarnated Starkweather as the character The Kid in his epic novel, The Stand. Lastly, 2 cult movies, the 1973 Badlands, starring Martin Sheen and Sissy Spacek, and 1994's Natural Born Killers, starring Woody Harrelson and Juliette Lewis, romanticized the epic spree killing of Starkweather and Fugate. As for the 2 real-life participants, their fates were quite different.
It is not unusual for a team, a man and a woman, a boy and a girl, to be treated the way that Starkweather and Fugate were treated by the court. In most cases, the court just can't believe that a woman could be that violent. And so she gets a parolable sentence and he gets the electric chair. And that's true in almost every case. So today, Carol Fugate is a middle-aged, middle-class housewife who lives somewhere. She did live in Michigan for a period of time and is now living a life of obscurity in I don't know where.
But Starkweather was sentenced to death. After only 17 months on death row, on June 25, 1959, he took a seat in the electric chair at the Nebraska State Penitentiary, where he fried for his crimes against humanity. That same year, another case of buddy spree killers would bring this newly defined type of extreme killer, the mass murderer, into the public's awareness. It occurred in a desolate area of western Kansas. On a dark night on a ranch outside of Holcomb, Kansas, 2 recently released convicts, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, killed 4 members of the Clutter family, one after another. Following a tip from a fellow convict, they went there to rob the home and ended up committing mass murder. A spree killing. Killing in succession the father, Herb, the mother, Bonnie, 16-year-old daughter, Nancy, and 15-year-old Kenyon. It has been said that neither of the two men by themselves would have committed this slaughter. And if not caught, it was also said they would have killed many more. This case inspired the 1966 book, In Cold Blood, written by novelist Truman Capote. It captured the Clutter family killing and in the process created a new genre of literature, the true crime fiction novel.
The significance of the Clutter murders that were committed in 1959 in Holcomb, Kansas, has a lot to do, of course, with Truman Capote writing a best-selling book about it. At the time the murders occurred in November of 1959, it was in fact reported by the New York Times. But it was that story that ran in the Times which is what intrigued Capote to write his book about it. He set off for Holcomb not too long after that and started interviewing residents of the town. Eventually he was able to make contact with Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, the two who were responsible for the Clutter murders, and ended up becoming fairly close friends, in fact, with Perry Smith before both Smith and Hickok were hanged in 1965.
And thus, Perry and Hickok met their maker at the end of a rope. Capote's In Cold Blood became the second best-selling true crime novel in the world, selling millions of copies. In 1993, another brilliant true crime novel was published, Dead Man Walking. Written by Catholic nun Sister Helen Prejean, the fictional killer in her book is a combination of two very real death row killers. Killers Sister Prejean knew personally. They were Elmo Sonier and Robert Lee Willie. Two men who knew nothing of each other, but nonetheless committed similar atrocities.
On the evening of November 4th, 1977, 16-year-old David LeBlanc and his 18-year-old girlfriend Loretta Ann Bork attended a high school football game. Later that evening, the couple drove to a remote spot in St. Martin's Parish, Louisiana, which was a common area used by young couples as a makeout spot. At around 1 a.m., while they were sitting in their car, they were approached by Elmo Sonier and his younger brother Eddie, who were out rabbit hunting in the woods. The Sonier brothers were a well-known pair of miscreants in the area, each with a long police record. One of them tapped on the window and produced a security guard badge. They then informed the teenagers that they were trespassing and that they'd have to accompany them to see the landowner to see if he wanted to press charges. LeBlanc and Bork were then handcuffed and placed into the back seat of their own car and were driven from there about 21 miles to an oil field in Iberia Parish. There they were once again forced from the vehicle, and David LeBlanc was marched towards a tree and handcuffed there. Elmo Sonier then raped Loretta Bork. They then were walking the couple back to their car when the two brothers began having an argument. Eddie insisted that they couldn't allow the young couple to live because they'd be able to identify them and they'd end up in prison. And eventually Elmo agreed. They forced LeBlanc and Bork to lie face down on the ground, and they were then both shot in the back of the head and killed.
But the Sonier brothers made one fatal mistake. They left their car at the original abduction scene. Police soon found LeBlanc's tire iron in the same car and was even able to locate the murder weapon that they had buried. Once arrested, Elmo confessed on 3 separate occasions that he had indeed raped Loretta Bork and killed them both.
They eventually went on trial in early 1978, where they began accusing each other of carrying out the shooting. The evidence pointed to Elmo as the possible shooter because he was the older brother and the more dominant of the two. But that didn't make any difference to the jury, and they both ended up getting the death penalty. However, at the appeal, the sentences were both overturned, and at a subsequent trial, Eddie's punishment was reduced to life in prison, while Elmo again got the death penalty.
3 years after the unspeakable crimes of the Sonier brothers, Robert Lee Willie and Joseph Vaquero, on the evening of May 28, 1980, committed a similar horrific act of violence.
Around 4:30 a.m., Willie and another miscreant, Joseph Jesse Vaquero, were cruising around when they spotted Faith Hathaway standing outside the Lakefront Theater, which was a nightclub in Mandeville, Louisiana. Hathaway was due to join the army the next day, and she'd actually attended a farewell party in her honor that night. Willie pulled over, offered Hathaway a lift, which she accepted, but instead of driving her home as he'd promised, he and Vaquero drove her to a secluded gorge in Franklinton, Louisiana, where Willie and Vaquero then took turns raping her before one or the other stabbed her to death, inflicting 17 wounds to her neck and to her head.
But the murderous duo was not yet done.
Vaquero and Willie attacked another couple just a couple of weeks later. 16-year-old Debbie Cuevas was brutally raped by them, and her 21-year-old boyfriend, Mark Brewster, was tied to a tree. He was beaten, he was cut with knives, he was burnt with cigarettes, and eventually they shot him in the head and left him for dead. Amazingly, Brewster actually survived the attack. In the meanwhile, Willie and Vaquero drove around with Debbie in their car, visiting various locations. They talked about killing her. Willie at one stage suggested locking her into the trunk of the car and setting it alight. Eventually they let her go, releasing her at the side of an isolated road and driving away.
They were soon arrested for aggravated assault, rape, and attempted murder. While in custody, both of the depraved sociopaths confessed to abducting Faith Hathaway, though each accused the other of the poor girl's rape and murder.
However, this was where Debbie Cuevas' testimony was very useful to the prosecution, because she was able to tell the court that Robert Lee Willie was undoubtedly the leader of the two, that Vaquero deferred to him. As a result, Willie ended up getting the death penalty, while Vaquero was sentenced to multiple terms of life imprisonment.
Both Sonier and Willie received spiritual counseling from Sister Helen Prejean. Their stories would inspire not only the book Dead Man Walking, but the critically acclaimed 1995 film by the same name, starring Sean Penn, who bears an uncanny resemblance to Willie himself. After several years on death row, both men would be executed in 1984 at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, 8 months apart. Each execution was witnessed by Sister Prejean.
When Sonier was strapped into the chair, he made his last final statement, apologizing to Lloyd LeBlanc, David LeBlanc's father, who was present. Although strangely, he made no comment to Loretta Bork's father, who was also there to witness the execution. He then turned to Sister Prejean and voiced, or mouthed to her rather, "I love you," and she responded back to him, "I love you too." The 4 alternating jolts of electricity were then passed through Sonier's body, and he was pronounced dead not long after. Robert Lee Willie was executed on December 28, 1984. In his final statement, he apologized to Faith Hathaway's parents, but he also said that killing in general was wrong, and that the state of Louisiana was therefore wrong to put him to death. When the hood was placed over Willie's head as he sat in the electric chair, he asked for it to be removed, and he then winked at Sister Helen Prejean before the hood was replaced again.
With that wink, Willie was electrocuted and pronounced dead soon after 12 o'clock. 3 years after Sonier and Willie met their deserved fates, in 1987, Ronald Jean Simmons would begin his march of death. A march of death on his own family.
Simmons felt that his life was miserable, and he blamed everybody but himself. He had had an incestuous relationship with one of his daughters. She had given birth to his son, who was also his grandson. His wife seemed as though she was going AWOL. She was going to desert him. Well, Christmas 1987, he had some of his extended kin. He had his adult children come to visit for Christmas. Many of them lived in Colorado and other areas of the country, and they all congregated together, and he killed all of them. But as if that was not enough, 14 victims. He waited a couple of days, and Monday morning he went into Russellville, nearby, and went to 5 different locations and shot several more people. He killed a young woman with whom he was romantically attached. She wasn't, but he was. He killed one of his former co-workers. He tried to kill his former boss, and then he put his guns down and was arrested.
A total loser, Simmons couldn't even kill himself. That dubious task was left up to the state.
He got the death penalty, he was executed, and he was very careful never to talk to the press, never to talk to criminologists who might have inspired some kind of compassion on the part of the public. He didn't want it. He wanted to die. He might not have had the courage to do it himself, so he let the state do it instead.
At the trial, he said, "To those who oppose the death penalty in my particular case, anything short of death would be cruel and unusual punishment. Simmons was sentenced to die and offered no appeals, wishing to be executed as soon as possible. His execution warrant was signed by none other than Arkansas Governor and later President Bill Clinton. On the morning of June 25, 1990, Ronald Jean Simmons woke up, dressed, and walked into the lethal injection chamber. Minutes later, his lifeless body was wheeled out and he was buried in a pauper's grave. While most death row killers pay the ultimate price for crimes committed outside prison walls, Robert Charles Gleason was executed for killing fellow inmates inside prison walls. His surprising motive? To rack up enough murders to be given the death penalty. But his string of murders would begin on the outside in 2007, in the dark shadows of Amherst County, Virginia.
Robert Charles Gleason was a violent offender, long rap sheet for assault and various drugs offences. At the time of the first murder he committed, the murder of Michael Jameson, he was a member of a methamphetamine drug ring. Jameson was also involved in the gang, but members of the gang had received information that Jameson was about to make a deal with the police and provide some information on the activities. They therefore decided that Jameson had to die. Gleason was given the job of taking care of it. He shot Jameson 4 times, twice in the head, twice in the chest, and then dumped his body in a wooded area in Amherst County, Virginia, thinking, of course, that it wouldn't be found for some time. But unfortunately for him, some hunters discovered the body the next day, and Gleason was arrested soon after.
At his trial, Gleason begged to be given the death penalty, but the courts wouldn't have it, dishing out life instead.
Once inside, he decided to make his point. So 2 years to the day after the Jameson murder, he murdered his cellmate Harvey Watson at Wallen Ridge State Prison Watson was tied up and tortured for some time by having socks shoved down his throat and also having a urine-soaked sponge shoved into his face. Eventually Gleason then strangled him and hid the body in the cell. Gleason then kept Watson's corpse in the cell for about 15 hours. His plan was to hold it there until rigor mortis has eased, so that he could then transport the body down to the garbage bins and dispose of it there. Unfortunately for him, the body was discovered before he could do that. Gleason was put on trial for the Watson homicide. Once again, he asked for the death penalty. But while he was awaiting sentencing, he was moved to Virginia's Supermax Red Onion prison, where he was placed in solitary confinement. On July 28, 2010, he was given time to spend in an exercise area. Also in the yard at the time was a young inmate by the name of Aaron Cooper. Gleason and Cooper were actually separated by a wire fence, but Gleason had a necklace with him, a necklace that he'd made, a religious artifact. So he asked Cooper if Cooper would be prepared to try the necklace on. And Cooper, being quite naive, agreed to do this. As soon as Gleason looped the necklace around Cooper's neck, he pulled it tight and pulled Cooper against the fence and began throttling him, eventually strangling him to death.
This time, the courts wasted no time in giving Gleason his much sought-after death penalty. Though most criminals spend years, even decades, on death row, Gleason waived all his appeals, awaiting execution for only 15 months.
Condemned prisoners in the state of Virginia are given the choice between the electric chair and lethal injection as a means of execution. Overwhelmingly, they choose lethal injection, but Gleason chose to be electrocuted. He was, in fact, one of only 7 out of 86 inmates that opted for this. And the reason that he gave at the time was that he believed that lethal injection was uncertain, the results were uncertain, and that electrocution would result in a quicker death.
Indeed, Gleason was electrocuted on January 16, 2013. A tough guy to the very end. For his last words, he quoted the infamous serial killer John Wayne Gacy and declared, "Kiss my ass." But where did Gleason's death wish come from? Why was he so dead set on putting himself to death?
The reason that Gleason wanted to die so badly, I think, are twofold. In fact, he said so himself. The first reason was he said that after the Cooper murder, he promised one of his family members that he would never kill anyone again. And he said that if he had stayed in prison, he most definitely would have killed somebody else. The second reason was that he wanted his death to be a warning to his sons so that they wouldn't follow in his footsteps in a life of crime.
A truly perverted sense of parenting for this cold-blooded jailhouse murderer. America's most notorious killers, whether they're Old West gunslingers, terrorists, kidnappers, callous bombers, the subject of true crime, or simply relentless murderers will eventually meet their maker. If not at the end of a life sentence, then at the end of a rope, sitting on Old Sparky, inhaling toxic gas, or receiving lethal drugs through an IV tube.